The house was too quiet for a place where a family was supposed to wake up. Dawn crept across the quiet suburban street in Frederick, Colorado, painting the driveways and manicured lawns in pale gold. Inside the two-story home, nothing stirred. No footsteps. No voices. No sign of a pregnant mother getting ready for the day or two little girls asking for breakfast. By mid-morning, the silence had become alarming. A patrol car rolled to a stop outside the house, lights flashing but sirens mercifully silent. Neighbors peeked through blinds as an officer stepped out, hand resting near his radio. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air felt wrong, still, heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. Shanann Watts and her daughters were gone. No struggle. No broken furniture. No blood. Just a purse left behind, shoes neatly placed, medications untouched. It looked less like a crime scene and more like a family that had vanished mid-thought, as if reality had glitched and erased them overnight. And the man who lived there, husband, father, was already at work. Miles away, at an oil site surrounded by steel tanks and endless sky, Chris Watts went about his morning like any other. He answered questions. He checked equipment. He nodded when coworkers spoke. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't seem rushed or alarmed. When police finally reached him, he didn't panic. Instead, he offered a calm explanation. Shanann had taken the girls to a friend's house after an argument. They needed space. Things had been tense. Marriages were hard sometimes. He said all the right words. Almost too perfectly. Investigators noticed it immediately, not what he said but how he said it. No anger. No fear. No urgency. His voice was flat, his posture relaxed, like a man discussing a missed appointment, not a missing family. He agreed to come home. Back at the house, cameras clicked as Chris stood in his driveway, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Local news vans had arrived. The story was already spreading. A pregnant woman and 2 children missing without a trace. Inside, detectives walked room to room, noting what didn't belong. Shanann's phone was found between couch cushions. Her wedding ring sat on the nightstand. A detail that struck one investigator hard. No mother would leave without her phone. No pregnant woman would walk away without her medication. Chris hovered nearby, watching them search his life. He spoke to reporters willingly, pleading for his family's safe return. His words were emotional, but his eyes didn't match. They darted. Blinked too slowly. When he said he missed his girls, there was no crack in his voice. The cameras caught everything. And so did the investigators. The first real crack in the story came quickly. A neighbor across the street mentioned something strange. He had security cameras. Motion activated. The kind that recorded everything even when nothing seemed important at the time. Police asked to see the footage. Chris stood beside them in the living room as the video loaded on a laptop. His arms folded tighter. His foot tapped the floor. The screen flickered to life. Early morning. Still dark. The Watts driveway came into view. Chris leaned forward, eyes locked on the screen as if he already knew what was coming. The footage showed him backing his truck into the driveway, something neighbors said he never did. He walked back and forth between the garage and the truck, disappearing out of frame each time. No children ran after him. No Shanann followed. Just Chris. Alone. Moving with purpose. The room went quiet. One detective glanced at another. This wasn't the behavior of a man whose family had simply left after a disagreement. This was preparation. When the video ended, Chris laughed nervously. He joked about how awkward it looked. About how bad it must seem. But no one laughed with him. That afternoon, investigators began digging into the cracks behind the perfect suburban image. They learned about the debt. The financial pressure. The cracks in the marriage that had been hidden behind social media smiles. They uncovered something else too, someone new. Chris had been having an affair. Messages revealed a man talking about freedom, about starting over, about a life without responsibility. A man who suddenly wanted out of everything he had built. Still, suspicion wasn't proof. Not yet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, police expanded their search. Dogs combed nearby fields. Officers knocked on doors. Friends and family flooded social media with desperate pleas. Chris stayed close to investigators, always visible, always cooperative. But there was one thing he couldn't control. Time. The more hours passed without a sign of Shanann or the girls, the heavier the truth became. Missing person cases had a rhythm, and this one was beating fast toward something darker. Late that night, a detective pulled Chris aside. They wanted him to take a polygraph. Chris didn't refuse. He agreed almost instantly. Too instantly. As he followed them down the hallway of the police station, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The walls were bare, cold, unforgiving. This wasn't a place for lies to survive long. He sat in the chair. Sensors were attached. Questions began softly, almost gently. But the machine didn't care about calm voices or polite answers. It only cared about the body. And Chris's body was screaming. Hours later, an investigator stepped out of the room and made a call. They had something. Not enough to arrest him yet. Not enough to charge him. But enough to know that the story Chris Watts was telling the world wasn't the truth. And as police prepared their next move, a search team miles away was heading toward a remote oil site, the same one where Chris had gone to work the morning after his family disappeared. Because buried beneath steel tanks and endless dirt, something waited. Something that would turn a missing persons case into one of the most chilling crimes America had seen. And when investigators finally reached that location, what they found there would make it impossible for Chris to pretend ever again. The oil site didn't look like a place where answers waited. It sat alone against the Colorado plains, all metal and dirt and wind, miles away from the neat streets and smiling neighbors of Frederick. Towering cylindrical tanks rose from the ground like silent sentinels, their steel sides streaked with grime. The air smelled faintly of chemicals and earth. It was the kind of place people came to work, not to disappear. Investigators arrived just after sunrise. They didn't have a warrant to dig yet. Not officially. But they had something just as powerful: permission. Chris had volunteered the site as part of his daily routine. He'd mentioned it casually, the way someone talks about grabbing coffee. That alone was enough to raise alarms. Very few missing persons cases involved the husband casually pointing investigators toward the last place he worked. As officers walked the grounds, radios crackled softly. Every step felt heavier than the last. The land was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it knew what it was hiding. Then someone spotted disturbed earth. It wasn't obvious at first. Just a patch of ground that didn't quite match the rest. A subtle difference in texture. In color. The kind of thing you'd only notice if you were already looking for something buried. A shovel hit dirt. Within minutes the air changed. The first body was Shanann. She was buried shallow, wrapped in a sheet, her pregnant belly unmistakable even beneath the soil. There were no signs of a struggle here, just the brutal finality of someone placed in the ground and covered like waste. One investigator stepped back, hand pressed to his mouth. Another stared, frozen, as the reality settled in. This wasn't a disappearance. It was a murder. And it didn't end there. Nearby stood two massive oil tanks, each filled with thick, black crude. The lids were bolted shut. Still, industrial. Not something anyone would think to search without reason. But now they had reason. When workers opened the first hatch, the smell hit instantly, overpowering, sickening. Inside, floating just below the surface, was something pale. Something small. One of the girls. By the time the second tank was opened, no one was speaking anymore. Words felt useless in the face of what had been done. The children had been forced through openings barely wide enough for their bodies. An act that required time, strength, and a level of cold detachment that made seasoned investigators feel physically ill. Chris Watts had gone to work that morning knowing exactly what was inside those tanks. And he had clocked in anyway. Back at the station, the tone shifted completely. This was no longer a search. It was a confrontation. Chris was brought in again, this time not as a worried husband, but as a man surrounded by evidence he couldn't explain away. His earlier calm had cracked. He fidgeted. His eyes darted. He asked questions he shouldn't have known to ask. When detectives told him the truth, that his family had been found, he didn't scream. He didn't collapse. He nodded. Almost like he'd been waiting for this moment. They didn't accuse him right away. They didn't need to. Instead, they let silence do the work. Let the weight of what had been uncovered press down on him. Finally he spoke. But not with the truth. He told them Shanann had killed the girls. That he'd walked in on something unthinkable. That he'd snapped. That he was trying to protect their memory even now. It was a story designed to soften the horror. To redirect blame. To make him seem human in a situation where humanity had long since vanished. Investigators listened. Took notes. Asked questions. Then they did something unexpected. They brought in his father. The room changed when his father sat across from him. This wasn't an interrogation anymore. It was something more intimate. More dangerous. A son facing the weight of his own actions, with the one person he might still want forgiveness from. Chris's voice trembled for the first time. He talked about stress. About pressure. About wanting a different life. He talked in circles, words piling on top of each other, as if enough explanation could bury the truth deeper. But lies don't survive confession rooms. They fracture. Slowly at first, then all at once. Chris leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands shaking. His eyes filled, not with grief but with fear. The kind of fear that comes when someone realizes there is no version of the story left that ends well. He swallowed hard. And then he said it. He admitted that he killed Shanann. The room went silent. But he still wasn't done. What followed was worse than anyone expected. Chris described the night in fragments: an argument, a decision, a moment he couldn't take back. He spoke about strangling his pregnant wife while she slept beside him. About how quiet it was afterward. How still. Then came the girls. He claimed they were alive when he put them in the truck. That they asked questions. That they trusted him. The words hung in the air, unbearable. He described driving for nearly an hour with their mother's body at their feet, the sun rising slowly as if nothing in the world had changed. He talked about how he carried them one by one to the tanks, and how he went to work afterward, as if it were just another Monday. By the time the confession ended, there was nothing left to investigate. The case was solved. But understanding it, that was something else entirely. Because the question that haunted everyone wasn't how Chris Watts was caught. It was how someone could live an ordinary life, smile for cameras, tuck children into bed, and then erase them without hesitation. As the paperwork was filed and charges prepared, investigators realized something chilling. Chris hadn't panicked. He hadn't tried to flee. He thought he could live with it. And if one small detail hadn't slipped, if a neighbor hadn't owned a camera, if police hadn't noticed his lack of emotion, he might have. Because sometimes the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who look like monsters. They're the ones who show up to work the next morning like nothing happened. And as the interrogation room door closed behind him, one final detail emerged. Something about Chris's motive that made the entire case even darker. Something that would come out only later. Something that would change how the world saw this crime forever. And when that truth surfaced, it would be impossible to forget. The confession should have been the end. For most cases it would have been. A clear motive. A clear suspect. A clear timeline that led from a quiet suburban home to a remote oil site where an entire family was erased. Paperwork was filed. Charges were prepared. The public thought they understood what had happened. But the truth didn't arrive all at once. It leaked out slowly through letters, interviews, and details Chris Watts never meant to share. And each new detail made the crime feel colder. In the days after his arrest, investigators reviewed everything again. Texts, emails, deleted searches, financial records. What emerged wasn't a moment of rage or panic. It was planning. Careful, deliberate, and disturbingly calm. Chris had been imagining a new life. Not a repaired marriage. Not counseling. Not shared custody. A clean slate. Messages revealed him talking about apartments, vacations, and future plans with the woman he was seeing. He spoke about freedom like it was something tangible, something just out of reach. His family wasn't part of that future. They were an obstacle. What shocked detectives most wasn't the affair. It was how early he had emotionally detached from his children. Friends and co-workers described him as quiet, dependable, almost invisible. The kind of man no one ever suspected of cruelty. But behind closed doors something had shifted. The empathy that should have stopped him never appeared. When asked later if he felt remorse, his answers were hollow. He spoke about consequences, not guilt. About regret, not grief. It was as if the reality of what he'd done never fully reached him. The sentencing hearing drew national attention. Shanann's family sat in the front row, holding each other upright. Photographs of the girls, bright smiles, tiny hands, were displayed for the court. Their presence filled the room in a way words never could. Chris stood when asked. He apologized. But even then, something was missing. There were no tears when he spoke their names. No visible collapse under the weight of his actions. Just a man reciting what he knew he was supposed to say. The judge didn't hesitate. Life sentences. Multiple. No possibility of parole. Chris Watts would never walk free again. For many, that should have been closure. But the story didn't end in that courtroom. From prison, Chris began to talk. He gave interviews. He wrote letters. And with each version, the story shifted slightly, small details changing, timelines adjusting, motivations blurring. He admitted things he hadn't before. Retracted others. The most chilling revelation came months later. He confessed that the girls hadn't died in their sleep as he had first implied. They woke up. They fought. They trusted him to protect them. The image haunted investigators. A father given multiple chances to stop, choosing instead to continue. Not because he had to, but because he wanted the life he believed waited on the other side. That detail changed everything. It wasn't a single bad decision. It was a series of them. Public reaction turned from shock to something darker. How could someone appear so normal and still be capable of this? Experts weighed in. Psychologists debated labels. Narcissism, emotional detachment, moral disengagement. But no diagnosis fully explained the silence where love should have been. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. Chris Watts didn't look like a monster because he wasn't one in the way people expect. He was ordinary. And that's what made the case linger. Years later, the house where it happened still stands. New families live nearby. Children ride bikes down the same streets. Life continues as it always does. But for those who know the story, something about that place will never feel normal again. Because the scariest part of this case isn't the oil tanks or the shallow grave. It's the morning after. The moment when Chris Watts woke up, got dressed, kissed no one goodbye, and drove to work under a rising sun, fully aware that his family no longer existed. No panic. No breakdown. Just routine. That's what stays with people. The idea that evil doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always rage or scream. Sometimes it blends in, shows up on time, answers emails, and smiles for cameras. Sometimes it lives next door. And if this story shook you, remember this: there are more cases like it. More truths hiding behind ordinary faces.